Well, hello everyone and Happy New Year. This is our first podcast of a brand new year. Well, I guess technically it's our second, but we recorded that one in 2022. But
that's right.
We are starting a new series today called Fables and Folktales, where we're going to be looking at all the parables of Jesus.
Yeah, so I'm kind of looking forward to this because these are, Jesus used this quite a bit in how he decided to share truths about himself and God's kingdom, and so it's really good for us to really take time and think and ruminate and discuss about what's being said within these parables, these folksy tales.
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to my mind is, or question, if you're like me at all, what's a parable?
Yeah, well, they really are stories with a meaning in there sometimes. Quite often, like kind of a hidden meaning.
Yeah.
There other words we use as fables, metaphors, allegory, simile, and they really are to talk about, like as we said, those kind of things about Jesus, things about principles, moral teachings, religious principles. In case of Jesus, about himself, about God's kingdom, in a way that. In kind of, I guess, the way that would meet people in their everyday sort of ideas, and to really allow people to word pictures and not just propositional statements, which is something we as a modern Western we do that, and that wouldn't have been so much so at that point. It would have been like this, leaving room for the ambiguous, leaving room for there's maybe more going on that, like, hey, here's kind of an answer with a lot of mystery behind it too.
Yeah, I think one of the things that distinguishes Jesus' parables from, say, a fable, like Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare kind of thing, and we have a specific, it's a pretty obvious meaning even for children, where Jesus' parables, again, were more about mostly or a lot of times about either the kingdom of heaven or himself. And essentially he's presenting people with a choice to either reject him or accept his teaching.
That's right.
Although, like you said, the teaching wasn't always what people were expecting, and it left room to not be the answer they kind of grew up with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's I think what maybe distinguishes Jesus' parables from other teachers who used fables and folktales to teach a specific principle.
Yeah, and I think there's something for us even today is the fact that it does leave pictures or these word pictures, which is a lot of what we're seeing here, does really allow our sort of understanding to really grow beyond, again, kind of like, say, hard facts, which is something I think for us really important that we don't, because that is a very modern westernized thing, is to want these things to be in sort of hard, simple facts and bullet points.
This is the meaning. I get it now, and it's done.
Yeah, and it's really, and not to say that there aren't some there. Yeah, but like there's also intentional ambiguity, and there's layers of meaning. Yeah, that there's a hard fact doesn't necessarily give us, and again, there's it's sometimes the hard facts leads us in a very, I think, a very direct way, and maybe that wasn't necessarily always Jesus's purpose.
I like how Tim Mackey in the Bible Project video on parables, and we'll link that in the show notes because it's very
really good,
very helpful. He said that in there that people with open minds would think about what Jesus was saying and might get to the answer on their own, where people with closed minds that think they knew everything wouldn't get there. And there was a specific reason for that. And I thought that was something I hadn't heard before in the video. But I guess going back one step is, why would Jesus talk in parables and not just teach like we do in sermons sometimes?
Well, because he wasn't a modern. It's actually quite normal. I mean, a lot of that is going back in time. It's like that. The way he would have taught parables would have actually been quite a normal practice for
I would agree,
a lot of that sort of stuff. And things weren't necessarily, again, in that sort of like bullet points of hard facts and stuff like that. And so I think there's that. And there's also, he does talk about it a little bit. It is really like that whole thing where just like to take time to be open-minded, to take time to think. And for those who weren't willing to really listen would miss some of the depth that's going on in there.
Yeah, and I think at that time, a lot of the religious teaching was done at synagogue, where they would read a portion of the Torah, and then the rabbi would either give his opinion on it or give an opinion of another rabbi that they studied under to sort of their interpretation of what that was. And so that was how they were used to being taught. And I think Jesus is literally trying to provoke their imagination a little bit. And I think that's not a bad thing. We could probably learn from that. So today we're looking at what's called the parable of the yeast. It's found in Matthew chapter 13 and also in Luke 13. So these are two accounts of Jesus' life. And they're actually very short. In Matthew, it's one verse, and in Luke, it's two. And it says here, Jesus also used this illustration. The kingdom of heaven is like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put only a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. And in Luke, very similarly, he also asked, what else is the kingdom of God like? It is like yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she only put a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. So what can we learn from these two simple verses?
Well, I think maybe going back a little bit to parables, but we see this here, like we use the idea of this analogy using baking.
Yeah.
Which, obviously I think back then, obviously now, baking is more of a choice than it is an everyday thing. There are people who love it, there are people who want to do it, but we can just go to the store and kind of get
we
it.
We buy our bread at a store, yeah.
Whereas is much like a lot of parables, if we look at that, this would have been a very everyday
activity. Yeah.
They're going to be baking every day. This is not going to be, again, a pastime so much as they don't have supermarkets. They don't have preservatives that allow us to leave the door. And so first we're starting with just a very, we'll say, an attainable, understandable thing. Much like, because there's lots of parables with agriculture. Obviously, that would have been a big everyday thing, or fishing. Right now, a lot of, most of us would do fishing if that's what you do at all. You do it because of a pastime.
Yeah,
this would have been a
job.
That a lot of people would have had, again, and every day, because, again, you don't have refrigeration and all that sort of things. I think you got to eat that fish
today
rather quickly. And so we do see kind of the idea of like the baking metaphor, which in that time would have been often the role of a woman.
Yep.
And therefore,
even says in the verse it's a woman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was more likely that you'd find a woman there. And so even with this parable, it does open up to Jesus saying the inclusivity of women.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
He just didn't do male-oriented jobs. Yep. This is or things. It was just there was female orientation as well.
Yeah, he was relating something that a woman could relate to.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of cool. So the first thing he says, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast. So how is the kingdom of heaven like yeast? Or what? Sorry, I guess maybe we should back up. When Jesus refers to the kingdom of heaven, what's he referring to? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that, and Jesus talked, I think, 2 different ways. The first one was that he's going to come back sometime in the future, and creation is going to be restored, and the kingdom of heaven will overlap with the earthly realm or the world we live in, and it'll be a physical kingdom. But I don't think that's, or I think it applies there. But I think Jesus also talked about the kingdom of heaven now. How is that different?
In the here and now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And basically the idea of the kingdom of heaven here and now is the Jesus followers.
Yep.
Those who are following him.
Which make up the church.
We hope so.
Yep. So and I think that's a really good point, is that this is more of a spiritual application, in that the kingdom of heaven is actually manifested in us as people by the fact that our lives are transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit, generosity and creativity. So that's a very spiritual example of how the kingdom of heaven is in the world, because Jesus said the kingdom of heaven arrives now with him.
That's right. It's at hand.
It's at hand. Yeah. It's here. So when he says the kingdom of heaven, this is what he's talking about. So what does the dough represent?
Well, I mean, it's basically the world as we find ourselves in.
Our current reality. Yep. So, and I think that also includes all the people.
Yep.
Obviously, humanity is created in God's image. So that's all of us. But I think there's also this aspect of our planet.
Absolutely.
And it's not really maybe not specifically relevant to the parable in the way we normally think about it. But I thought this was interesting to me, was that humans, or in this case Adam, were given the responsibility for the environment. That was his job. And so we see that when the dough represents people and our physical world.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I thought was interesting. So we've now have the yeast being mixed into the dough, and we see this change start to happen. But we see the effects of the change, but we don't see how the change is happening.
That's right.
So the yeast actually works invisibly and kind of from the inside out.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of thoughts that I have in that moment. Is that one is it's the invisible side of things, and that's not to say that it's everything you make sure you do is never seen kind of idea. But I think it's more the idea of it doesn't need to be this big flashy thing, which I think sometimes we can absolutely get caught up. If it's not this big thing, it's not going to make a difference. And I'm really seeing what Jesus is saying here, especially if you think about the people that he's probably talking to, who are not necessarily the influencers of that ancient world.
Yeah.
And he just said, like, no, you don't understand. The biggest change is not going to come from that one religious leader, no matter how amazing he might legitimately be
influential.
It's really going to come from those people in the everyday kind of things that are integrated into all that sort of stuff that might actually not even be really noticeable, and really because more the idea of ordinary. You're going to make a huge difference.
That an ordinary person can make a difference.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really I really liked when I read this about how that or that part of it really struck a chord with me, in that lots of times we think it's the other way. We have to it's going to happen through politics, or it's going to happen through a social movement, or it's going to happen from a military perspective, something from the outside the norm,
or celebrity personalities and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Which is more probably relevant to today. We look to our superhero pastors or the churches or ministries that have large followings to be able to make the biggest impact, when really Jesus is saying here it's everybody in their everyday ordinary life is what makes the biggest difference. And I think, where do they make a difference? It's where we live, work, and play. And I think if we look at the inverse of that, or for this to happen for Jesus followers, we have to interact with people who are not Jesus followers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something we don't always think about or live by. We sometimes Christians like to, we shop at Christian businesses, and we send our kids to Christian schools, and we do all our social activities at a church. And for some people, it would be very hard for them to even name a person that they are friends with that is not a follower of Jesus.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to think that idea. It is this integration of in the midst of that is so important. And sometimes I think we can be scared of, because I think we automatically think the other way. We don't think about how we, as followers of Jesus, true followers of Jesus, can be a really positive influence to the world around us. We more go into that scarcity protective moments of like, how are they going to negatively impact me?
Yeah.
And I think it's definitely could be the idea of like, we're maybe missing out the wonder and power of the love of Jesus, and how he could impact the world and somehow amazingly use us.
Yeah, through us. That's the big thing. That always strikes me as odd sometimes, that we have this sort of all-powerful being, God, and he chooses to work through us who are flawed and human, and we don't think we have the ability to make a big impact.
No, and I think, I know I can absolutely, I fall in this trap too often. I really can be more aware of what I don't have and what I lack, and miss out that there might be something that I do have that actually
Yeah.
is doing something, and just to be able to trust that God can use that.
Yeah.
As much as I can get down on myself, God can use those things, and just be thankful and humbled by that notion. And again, I think the whole idea is that some of the greatest impact, I'll use that word, is not going to be through an explosion of fireworks, which I think needs to be. It's going to be through time, through faithfulness, through years.
Yep.
And not just this one-time sort of moment. Like I think too often as a church we get like that one sermon that'll save the world, and it's just sort of like, no, faithfulness.
Yep.
Is
Day in,
how
day
we
out.
want.
It does take time, and I agree with you. That's I think as a church, our institution of church, we talk about gifts of the Spirit and volunteering, but too often we try and contain that within the church. You need to work in children's ministry, you need to work in the nursery, or you need to take up the offering. And really, those gifts are meant to be out in the world, impacting the people
Absolutely.
so it's really through our words and our actions out there that point people to Jesus. All right. And I think the other idea here is that Jesus says is that the yeast permeates the dough. And that it starts off with just a teeny tiny bit of yeast. And I think he uses 3 measures of flour. And I couldn't quite come up with how much 3 measures of flour was. Some were saying it was like 60 pounds or something. It was a lot anyway. Like more than the average person would make for a daily meal.
Okay.
This would be more like for a party or something.
Right.
And so when the yeast is mixed into the dough, it actually works its way through the dough, in that the yeast actually multiplies itself inside the dough. And I was just trying to think, so what is that? What is Jesus trying to tell us here, in that if yeast permeates the dough, the kingdom of heaven will permeate the world?
Maybe. I mean, either that, or maybe it's just the idea of focusing on not sort of the exact measurements, but just sort of like, this is a lot, this is a little. The little is going to make a big impact.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised. Because it goes back to the, I don't want to get too much into it because we'll talk about it here.
Yeah.
But this is kind of in the idea of the mustard seed.
Yeah.
It's the small seed that actually grows into this great plant. Mm-hmm. I think really we're looking at that sort of idea of, again, kind of changing the idea of, it needs to be this huge thing. And it's like, no, look how the yeast can go through this huge thing and really make a significant difference.
Yeah, and I think if I were to break that down, the way I looked at this was the idea of, it reminded me of the part where Jesus said to pray for workers for the harvest. And where do those workers come from? And in that particular context, Jesus is talking about preaching the good news to other people and them coming to follow him, is that the workers come from the harvest. And I think that could be applied here in the idea that we, by the power of the Holy Spirit, are transformed by Jesus ourselves. And then when we point people to Jesus and they choose to follow Jesus, they in turn tell other people, or by their words and actions point other people to Jesus. And then we get that sort of multiplication effect. And that's where we see that sort of permeating idea, is that there's a great potential in each one of us and the people that we might point to Jesus doing the same thing.
Yeah, and I think, again, going back to the idea, it doesn't need to start big.
No.
In fact, it won't.
It won't. It's almost, it's going to start small.
Yeah, and I think it's a place of encouragement.
Yeah.
I think ultimately he's really wanting people to be encouraged by this.
Yeah.
Because they might be thinking, really? What's the point? That just seems too big.
Yep.
It's too overwhelming. And he's like, no, trust me.
And I like the idea of what you just did, and I did too, is that we related it to other parables and other teachings of Jesus. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we read the parables, we get like a hard fact out of it, and we don't see how it relates to other things. And really, Jesus is giving us different perspectives of the kingdom of heaven and himself through all of the parables.
That's right.
And they have to be taken together. So
it absolutely helps. And it helps build all that sort of stuff, is to realize that when Jesus was talking, it wasn't just sort of like, if you name all the parables and teachings of Jesus, it's sort of like, and he's talking, and it's whatever, 80, he's talking about 80 different things. It's like, no, he's interwoven all of these things, and they all work together. They work beside, and sometimes it's the same thing from a different perspective, or alongside, and we've got this interconnected thing of what it means to be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah, that's really cool. I really like that.
So thank you so much for joining us for this video. We'll have many more coming as we go through the parables. Please like and subscribe. Drop some comments. We can do more of this sort of thing. Feel free to go to other channels where we will be talking about, through our live stream on Sunday mornings, we're talking about more parables there too, in that format. And as well as we'll do stuff, we'll go through pretty much all the parables in this format.
Yeah.
Again, thank you so much. Take time to think about the parables Jesus is saying. What's wonderful is there's so many ways we can do that, whether that's reading whatever translation you prefer, or going and finding an audio version where you can just you can close your eyes and maybe hear it, kind of like it's being taught to you in that sort of moment, maybe we're there, however it is, and just sort of think about the parable, what it's saying, and even our best understanding of some of those things which would have been an everyday thing for them, are not necessary for us, but even try to put ourselves into those shoes or sandals, whatever you prefer to say. Just sit down in the dust and just listen to these parables as like Jesus is speaking them for the first time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great week.